Hi everyone, Tammy here, Flannel Chick MTB. Welcome to my channel. On today's video, I want to talk with you about my layman's view on the differences between a downhill race and an enduro race. So once again, I am coming to you from my basement. Now, it seems to be a theme this 2022 mountain bike season: rain, rain, rain. And our trails are a sloppy, muddy mess right now. So needless to say, I am once again off my bike. Now, you might be wondering, why aren't you riding in the rain? And if you haven't already caught my last video, my 2-minute rant on wet weather riding in Alberta, check out that video. I'll link it in the description below. Now, given that I am off my bike, I thought, how could I use this time and deliver you a video? And so I thought, I'm going to share with you on a topic that I am myself learning about right now. And that is, what is the difference between enduro mountain bike racing and downhill racing? So if you're curious at all, just getting into mountain biking, and you're curious about the race scene, or you have a friend or family member who races mountain bikes and you don't have a clue what they're talking about, this video might be for you. What the heck is an enduro race? Now, before I get started, if you're looking for a video to introduce you into the world of mountain bike racing, this probably is not for you. There are tons of really good videos though. I was just watching one this morning from Pink Bike talking about your first enduro race, how to prepare for that, or how to prepare for a downhill race. So YouTube can answer all those questions you have if you're looking to get started and dabble a little bit in the race world. But for today's purposes, let me just talk with you about how I see the differences from a spectator point of view. So let's talk about how a race is won. So regardless of whether we're talking about downhill racing or enduro racing, and I'll talk more about the specifics, what differentiates them, regardless, both downhill and enduro racing are timed competitions. So there's no points for style like in freestyle. The racers are riding against other racers and against the clock. But unlike in some disciplines, there isn't a mass start in either of these disciplines. So racers start the race individually at the start gate and are timed to the bottom. Now, in downhill racing and in enduro racing, in fact, racers are timed on the descents only. So from the moment that they cross the start gate,
Good luck.
to the bottom of the course, to the bottom of the track, that is where they accumulate their times. Now, even though downhill and enduro racers are being timed on their descent, there's a huge difference in terms of how that descent happens. Now, in a downhill race, racers achieve their time on a particular track on a particular course from start to bottom. Whereas in an enduro race, and I'll talk more about this, there are numerous race stages, and each stage has its own time. And in the end, racers make an overall cumulative time for all of the races combined. And so you can think about this as a DH race, a downhill race, almost like one race, and an enduro race, multiple mini races or stages where each stage is timed, and at the end of the event, whether that be a one-day event, a weekend event, 4 or 5 days of racing, the racer's cumulative time is what determines where they place in that race. Now, in both downhill racing and enduro racing, racers are racing against other racers in their category. I'm not going to get into that. Categories are different depending on the event sometimes and the number of people participating, or on the event organizers, but it's fair to say that there are different categories and a racer is racing against the other races who are also in the similar category. Now, If the racers are being timed on the descent, you have to get up to be able to get down. And this, I think, is one of the biggest differences between downhill racing and enduro racing. In a downhill race, racers are assisted to the top of a mountain, to the top of a course, to the top of a trail. They often will be taking a chairlift to the top of the race course. Sometimes in some events that aren't chairlift assisted, there might be shuttles that are shuttling the racers to the top of the course. In an enduro race, racers are required to get to the top of the course under their own power, unassisted. So what this means is in an enduro race, racers are pedaling and or walking to the top of their stage where the race course begins. And if there are 2, 3, 4, 8 stages in a race, then the racers will be going between stages up and down the mountain at various points in the mountain by pedal power. So rather than ride the chairlift, get off at the top, and then be timed on the descent, enduro racers are pedaling to the stage, getting to the start gate, getting to the start of the course, and then racing down. Now, all the time that they take to pedal between stages is not timed, although there are obviously, within reason, some limitations so that a race doesn't go on for weeks on end. Racers are allowed to pedal however slowly or however quickly they want to get between stages within reason. Now, to save energy, some racers will decide to push their bikes to walk between stages, and this is perfectly acceptable. The racer needs to be under their own power, but they're not required to be on their bike the entire time pedaling between stages. So, in a nutshell, one of the biggest differences are how racers get to the top of the mountain to start their race descent. Downhill, often chairlift or shuttle. Enduro, under their own power pedaling. Now, a note about that, there are some really big enduro races where one of the stages might be assisted by a shuttle or a chairlift. But I think in general, it's fair to say the general rule of thumb for enduro races is that racers are pedaling or walking the mountain to be raced on their descent. Now, I mentioned, unlike some other disciplines in mountain biking, there are no mass starts in enduro races or in downhill races. Now, on the first day of the race, or on the first day of the second day of the race, for instance, categories might have a start time where everyone in U21, for instance, is starting their way up the mountain to begin the first stage.
All right, and as they're heading off to the mountain today, we have on deck our U21 men. That's men 16 to 20 racing in the U21 men's category.
That being said, given that that's not timed, that really isn't a mass start time. However, categories at the beginning of a race, you might see groups of people pedaling up the mountain together, but they are not being timed on that climb again. And so in fact, they are not racing at that point. In downhill racing, similarly, each racer has his or her own start time. They are given a drop-in time, a time when their race plate, when they as racers need to be at the start gate to start their descent, to start their timed descent. Now, there are usually 30 to 60 seconds between racers. And so one racer is given the go, they start down the course, down the track, 30 seconds later, sometimes a minute later, but often in downhill racing, 30 seconds is given in between. The next racer goes down. So it is possible that a racer behind will catch up to a racer in front, maybe because they are a faster rider, or perhaps the racer in front had a crash or had an issue with their bike that slowed them down and allowed the racer behind to catch up. But aside from these situations where racers are passing another racer, Racers are pretty much individually on the track at any given point in time, racing their own race against the clock. One of the ways to think about the difference between a downhill race and an enduro race is in minutes versus hours and days. A typical downhill race might involve a racer taking the chairlift to the top of the mountain, waiting for their start time, and doing a descent, a race descent. Now, a downhill race could take maybe 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 6 minutes. I've seen downhill races that take about 8 minutes. But on average, downhill races are way shorter than enduro races. And so a racer has about a 2 minute to an 8 minute, for instance, race. In an enduro racer has multiple stages in a day. For instance, on a Saturday, there might be 3 stages, and on the Sunday of that weekend race, there might be another 4 stages. And on that one day, the racer is essentially racing 3 stages or 3 races inside that one day. And in between each descent, remember, there is a climb back up the mountain, a transfer to somewhere on the mountain, wherever the next stage occurs. Oftentimes, more often than not, the stages are on different tracks, on different courses, on different trails. And so the enduro racer is going from one course to another to another. So I kind of think about it like mini downhill races packed into one day. Now, when you think about timing of this, what that means is a downhill race, a racer gets their drop-in time, chairlifts to the top, waits at the gate, does their race, and essentially they could be over their entire race 5 minutes or less. They've done all kinds of preparation for weeks, and the race is over. They get one shot at it on that track at that start time. Whereas an enduro race, the racer is pretty much racing all day. It's not uncommon for it to take a rider half an hour, 45 minutes, over an hour just to climb the mountain to the start gate before they start their descent, which is timed. And so in an enduro race, it really is an all-day affair. And so although they're not being timed all day, how long it takes to get through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stages obviously is much longer, given that the tracks tend to be a little bit longer, the courses tend to be a little bit longer, and they're pedaling in between stages. Turns a downhill race from something that takes a rider minutes really to a full day affair for an enduro racer. So one of the big differences about downhill racing versus enduro racing is that there really are no do-overs. In downhill racing, there very is little wiggle room. If you imagine that a race could take maybe as little as 2.5 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes, running into a mechanical or having a crash on a downhill race has a significant impact on a racer's outcome. So in a typical race day for a downhill racer, they might have a few practice runs in the morning, they might not, but they would typically load on the chairlift, giving themselves enough time to get to the top, do whatever preparation they do at the top, and then race down. They essentially have that one course, that one race, that one, let's say 5 minutes to make their mark in that race. Whereas in an enduro race, because there are multiple stages, my sense is it's a little more forgiving in terms of crashes and mechanicals. It's not uncommon for, out of 7 stages, a racer to have a crash or multiple crashes on a particular stage, or even have a mechanical, a flat that they need to stop midway, fix their tire, interrupt their descent, and still fare really well at the end of that race weekend. Because there are so many stages, it's bound that each racer is probably at some point over the course of an entire weekend race going to either have a mechanical or have a crash. And so because of those multiple stages, I think it tends to average out a little bit better and is a little more forgiving for those uncontrollables that can sometimes happen in a race. Now, one of the other differences that I've noticed as a spectator and as a mom to a racer is how the preparation for downhill racing is quite different than the preparation for an enduro race. Now, in downhill racing, it's not uncommon that there is a practice day before the race. So sometimes racers will arrive to the hill on a Friday, for instance, and there might be open practices. And that's practice where everyone who's racing in that race that weekend has access to the race course, and they can practice. They can ride as many laps as their body and their bike allows on that day. And then the following day, there often might be category specific practice times where racers are allowed on the course with their category from this time to this time, and they're allowed to do whatever preparation, whatever practice they see fit during that time. And then often race day is on the Sunday. Now, because racers who are racing downhill have lift access, generally speaking, they're only limited really by how long the chairlift is open. They can get in as many laps as they would like in their practice days. And because they are only riding one single track, one course, they can ride that course, that track over and over and over and over again. By the time a racer races on a Sunday in a downhill race, barring mechanical issues or injuries that prevented them from practicing, a racer has had lots of exposure to that track, to that course. And so they're going into that race having spent days only riding that course, familiarizing themselves with their lines, with the corners, with the features. And so their preparation is quite solid on that particular track. Now, in an enduro race, it's very different. You can imagine if you show up to an enduro race on a Friday and the race is starting on Saturday and running on Sunday, you have one day to familiarize yourself with perhaps 7 stages. 7 different courses, 7 different tracks. Remember, you're pedaling or walking up the mountain, so there's only so many laps you can get in. And my experience in enduro racing has been in talking with racers that it's not all that uncommon for some racers to end up racing on a course, on a track, blind, meaning they've never even ridden it. So racers will make some decisions about how they're best going to prepare for an enduro race given the limited amount of time that they have before a race. And so some will try to ride all the stages and at least have a good look at them. Others will focus on particularly more challenging tracks or more challenging trails based on their skill, based on what they're good at, what they struggle with. They might decide to spend an entire practice day on a handful of stages, getting really comfortable with them, trusting that the other tracks they're more familiar with, or they're more like things that they are familiar with and they don't need to spend as much time. But because of the length of an enduro race and the number of stages, again, it isn't uncommon that racers aren't going to be as familiar necessarily with the course, with the track they're racing as compared to a downhill racer. Now, the other thing that's a little bit different that I've noticed as an observer to downhill racing and enduro racing is something called the course walk. Now, in downhill racing, a course walk is a very standard practice. And so oftentimes on a Friday or on a Saturday evening, a racer at the end of the day perhaps will go up the chairlift without without their bike, and they will walk down the track and they will take the time to look at lines, make decisions about their race strategy based on the conditions and based on potential conditions that might occur over the weekend. Now, again, because enduro races are so vast in terms of the geography covered, the elevation covered, and the number of stages, enduro racers, although they have the option during practice, obviously, to get off their bike and to walk a track and make some decisions for themselves, there isn't as much opportunity for them to do that, I think, as compared to a downhill racer because their practice time is limited in that they have a lot more ground to cover by pedaling the mountain versus being able to access the course on a chairlift. Now, as a spectator, if you're watching an enduro race or a downhill race, you're not going to notice a whole lot of difference in terms of the gear that the racers wear. I think it's pretty standard. Most enduro races now, I think, have a requirement that racers wear a full face. And in downhill racing, racers also are required to wear a full face helmet. Aside from that, gear tends to be pretty personal. But what you will notice nowadays, maybe that historically was a little bit different, is that the bike choice is a little bit variable nowadays. It used to be that downhill bikes were used for downhill races and enduro bikes were used for enduro racing. Now, with the development of great, incredible all mountain purpose bikes, there's less of a differentiation, I'm noticing. So it's not uncommon to see a downhill racer racing on an enduro bike. Now, the flip doesn't necessarily apply because of the geometry of a downhill bike and the heaviness of the bikes. Although an enduro bike can be used for a downhill race, a downhill bike isn't used for an enduro race. So if you've ever sat in on a downhill bike and tried to pedal it, pedaling it up a mountain for 7 stages, that would be an entire discipline on its own. Now, as a spectator, you might be wondering about what the rules are to downhill mountain biking versus enduro. And I'm not going to get too much into that, except to say that there are some fine little differences in terms of riding inside the tape on a downhill race versus an enduro. Now, you might notice if you go to a downhill race, the entire track is taped. In an enduro race, it's quite different. Less is more. There doesn't tend to be a lot of tape on an enduro race course, except for maybe flags and showing riders kind of where transitions are, or keeping them on course if there's a feature or there's an element of the trail that might pose a danger. And so there are some little differences in terms of staying inside the tape and what that means on a downhill race and what a racer is required to do if they go outside the tape as compared to an enduro race. If you're curious about that and you're curious about what are kind of some of the other rules for racing enduro versus racing downhill, take a look at cyclingcanada.ca's website. They have tons of information on what racers can expect in terms of rules, and as a spectator, there might be something there that's interesting to you as well. Now, as a mom going out to these races, the entire point of being out there is to cheer my son on and to cheer his team on the race. And so if you're a spectator going to your first downhill or your first enduro race, here are some things to keep in mind. You will only get a glimpse of the race. Because the race occurs down an entire mountain, as a spectator, you need to make a decision as to where you're going to stand and where you're going to watch. And so, in effect, for that second that your racer passes you by, that's probably the extent of what you're going to see in terms of their race. Now, oftentimes in an enduro race, because there are multiple stages, as a spectator, you might pick a spot on the mountain to watch stage 1, and then you might move yourself around on the mountain to watch stage 2, and you might move yourself again around the mountain to watch stage 3, because all of those stages are typically happening on a different track, on a different course. And so you're going to keep this in mind, and you're going to plan how you're going to spectate based on where the stages are occurring and the trails that are part of that particular stage. But truth be told, if you're going out to watch a mountain bike race, you're going to see your racer for a split second, and then you're going to be able to sit back and watch everyone else in that category on that particular section of trail that you've decided to watch from. So, in a nutshell, I guess the biggest differences between an enduro race and a downhill race are the fact that a downhill race occurs on one track, one course, one race. There's no do-overs. And an enduro race occurs over the course of at least a day or two, or maybe even more, with at least 2 or multiple stages. So mini races inside an entire race where the riders or the racers' cumulative time determines how they place in that race. Versus downhill, one race, one track, one go, and that's where you stand at the end of the race based on your time. So I'm curious, did you learn anything new today? Was there anything about downhill racing or enduro racing in terms of their similarities and their differences that you weren't aware of? Do you have any questions for me? I'm certainly not the expert, but if you do and I can answer, I'd be happy to chat with you, so leave a comment below. And if I don't know the answer, I'll just say hello. I hope you found this helpful today. If you have anyone in your life who is new to mountain bike racing, who maybe is trying to support or encourage a friend or a family member in their race pursuits and they don't have a clue about racing and this video would be helpful for them, please feel free to share it. Again, hit the like button, please do subscribe, and happy riding, everyone.